for the time has come to decide the fate of both the living and the dead.
You're a god though, why don't you do it? When I first saw gameplay footage of Arken Age, I wasn't exactly hyped. It looked pretty good, but I don't ride hype trains. After playing it though, I'll admit it's a well-made game, when ignoring some visual problems I'll touch on later. But even though this game isn't my cup of tea, I can see why people are loving it. So, is Arken Age the must-play VR title everyone is saying it is? Well, to figure that out, we've got to start with what this game is about. At its core, Arken Age does deliver on what it promises, an immersive single-player sci-fi fantasy adventure. This game takes place on a terraformed world created by the unresponsive Grand Arborist, and you're created with the purpose of finding out exactly what's going on. It blends fantasy and sci-fi in a way that makes the initial gameplay pretty fun. Conceptually, the world building here is solid. The pacing of the game itself, though, can be a problem. Arken Age does introduce deep lore, but it doesn't hook me like games before it. You're dropped into a world with plenty of history and context, but instead of easing you in with compelling quests, after the first enjoyable 20 minutes of tutorial, you're on kill quests for about an hour with stories sprinkled in. Don't get me wrong, the combat is good, and we'll get into that in a second, but the first objectives feel more like busy work than a meaningful introduction to the world. In a nutshell, the progression could be better. Of course, I've got to give credit where it's due, because if there's one thing Arken Age does right, it's making you feel like you're there. Playing as a three-fingered alien felt more natural than I expected it would. The mechanics themselves lean heavily into immersion, and for the most part, they work really well. From interacting with objects to engaging in combat, everything feels intentionally designed for VR. And if you're thinking, duh, it's a VR game, you'd be surprised how many VR games feel like they have no right being a VR game. Right away though, you feel the immersion in this game's world interactions. Objects respond to gravity, much like Half-Life Alyx's gravity gloves, letting you pull things toward you with the flick of a wrist. It's not as polished an experience, but it feels better than objects simply zooming at you. Small details like that, and like tablets that actually function like tablets, touchscreen and all, add to the immersion. I'm actually seeing more of this in newer VR titles, and I'm definitely all for it. Even the new quest marker is handled in a way that makes sense within a VR game. I'm surprised players manage without one for a time, given how easy it is to get lost, but it's well done all things considered. The various crafting stations are well implemented too. Each station has its own set of immersive controls, some of which could be a little more intuitive, but all of which take advantage of VR capabilities. Even climbing feels good in this game. The way you whip out your climbing picks feels great when it works, which is most of the time. What doesn't quite feel as immersive though is the inventory system. Your weapons have their usual place in standard VR body slots. As for your tablet, you can open it with the push of a button to see your inventory, but the items you'll be using the most appear in front of you also with the push of a button. I've lost count of how many times I accidentally pulled out my tablet instead of my shield and vice versa, which brings us to combat. In a phrase, combat is fun but it isn't easy, and that's okay. Even on normal difficulty, enemies are aggressive and they don't just stand there waiting to be hit. They'll do things like jumping, sliding, and dodging. They'll even kick you if you stay in their personal space too long. It's some of the better melee combat I've seen in VR. Physics-based melee just makes fights feel more dynamic, but on rare occasions you should expect the usual jank that comes with physics-based anything. Now, as far as graphics go, Arken Age goes for a stylized, cartoonish fantasy look. While that kind of art direction can sometimes feel cheap, it just works for VR for performance reasons. The world design, the NPCs, and the visual effects all feel cohesive, making the game visually consistent, even if the graphic quality itself is just okay. Unfortunately, I ran into a problem that I haven't seen anyone else talking about. While the art style fits the game well, my experience on PC was not smooth. I ran into some persistently random screen stuttering that made gameplay noticeably choppy. At first, I thought it was my hardware or something I had misconfigured, but after an hour of troubleshooting and testing other games, I couldn't find a fix or even replicate the issue in any other game. Strangely enough, it doesn't even show up much in my footage, but trust me, inside the headset it was a rough ride. If you notice the persistent mouse cursor in my gameplay clips, that's because re-recording hours of stuttery footage wasn't an option for me. Hopefully this is just a one-off thing and my PC being weird, but since no one else seems to be having this problem, it won't factor into the final score towards the end of the video. But while we're on the topic of graphics, the weapons in Arken Age look as good as they are fun to use. The ability to color customize your main weapons is a nice and unexpected touch. It feels a bit out of place, as if the developers had experimented with it and decided to keep it in the game because it turned out well, but it's not a bad thing, it just feels a bit random. If there's one thing I can't knock though, it's the creativity behind these environments. The world of Arken Age feels very original. The unique structures make exploring more enjoyable, even if up-close textures, especially in less obvious spots, aren't the best. The graphical quality is here. It won't blow you away, but it does do its job well. Now, audio on the other hand is something that Arken Age absolutely delivers on.
Inside each of us, there is a seed of both light and darkness.
From voice acting to sound design, everything is handled well and I have zero complaints. You definitely won't be stuck reading walls of text. Everything from the tutorial to the story is fully voiced, which makes a huge difference in immersion for obvious reasons. Voice dialogue is quickly becoming the VR standard, and Arken Age thankfully follows through. The sound cues also hit right. Enemies will shout when they're alerted to you, adding a pinch more immersion to the whole experience. The background music blends perfectly here, and sound effects all feel like they belong. Regardless of whether you're messing with crafting stations or just listening around, the sound design here feels solid. The options and settings also massively deliver here. Comfort is everything in VR, and Arken Age gives you a lot to work with here. With the exception of a slight hiccup I'll talk about in a second, the options menu is stacked with customizable features. One such feature is the next level control over your vignette settings. Instead of an on-off toggle with a slider thrown in, Arken Age gives you an entire section dedicated to vignette adjustments, right down to the dead zones on your controller. This level of detail is incredible and definitely not something I expected. Of course, you have the option to play seated or standing as well, and adjusting the dominant hand for your usual body slots is as simple as pressing a button. Pressing a button immersively, I might add, because it's all touch controls. Beyond comfort though, the game also includes multi-language support and a solid range of graphical settings. The earlier hinted problem was that some options don't seem to work unless you toggle them off and back on. It's a minor inconvenience, but it's worth mentioning and something I'm sure can be easily fixed. At the end of the day though, Arken Age delivers a well-rounded experience that takes advantage of what can be done in VR. It's not perfect, but it's immersive and packed with thoughtful design choices that do make it stand out. Theme gets a 6 out of 6 because the atmosphere, lore, and world building are all solid. Mechanics gets a 5 out of 6. Minor complaints aside, this game is well designed from a mechanics perspective. Graphics gets a 4 out of 6. This game has a solid art style, but that can only take graphics so far. Audio gets a 6 out of 6 because I can't find anything to complain about here, it's all well done. And options gets a 5 out of 6 because the amount of adjustability here is just big. Arken Age may not be my type of game, but I'm pretty proud of what we've accomplished. You guys may not realize it, but I've been putting every bit of constructive feedback from your thoughts and comments into improving this scoring system over the last year, so thank you guys, I really mean that. Without you, bias would have taken over and given this game an immersion score outside of what it deserves, which by the way is an impressive 5 out of 6. There's just no denying that this game does a lot well, so it's worth a shot if you're looking for your next VR title. Don't forget to give this video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe for weekly VR content, and follow me on X. But until next time. Is that an RPG? Oh, it's a harpoon gun. No, it's just a normal harpoon. Oh, that's less exciting.